caught a bit of controversy, Michael, on the kind of the whole elitism thing. I mean, I think you may be at risk of being accused of this. Your recent article in the New York Times caused a bit of a stir within the psychedelic community. And I'm not sure I fully understood either, but it was the kind of distinction perhaps between... So you've written this article in response to the recent decriminalisation vote in Denver on psilocybin. And you said decriminalisation good, but you were kind of a bit concerned about the possibilities of legalisation and taking it down the ballot box route. Could you kind of expand on that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about it. So this was an op-ed that I wrote the day after Denver. It didn't exactly decriminalize. It's still a crime to possess psilocybin in Denver because the voters of one city can't change the state law or the national law, obviously. But it did order the police department to make psilocybin crimes their lowest priority. So in effect, it decriminalized it. And I said that if I lived in Denver and voted there, I would have voted yes. It would be hypocritical for me to say anything else because I have possessed, used, and cultivated psilocybin. But I was urging caution about moving to a political campaign right now to legalize psilocybin. Because the basic assumption behind this campaign, which is getting started in the United States, is that we can follow the playbook we did for cannabis. And I think it's a very different case. And I think it's a mistake to conflate those two things. One, at the level of the drug experience, I think it's much more consequential using psychedelics. I think there's greater risk, psychological risk, not physiological risk. And that when you legalize something, and I've seen this because I live in California, when you legalize something, not only do you make it available to people, but it gets pushed on you by large corporations marketing it very aggressively. I mean, when I come home from this trip, I will drive over the Bay Bridge and I'll see 3 giant billboards for cannabis delivery services that will have cannabis at my doorstep in 2 hours. No questions asked. I guess they ask you how old you are. So I have that concern, but it's also not like cannabis in this sense. It was really important to decriminalize or legalize cannabis because it was at the heart of the drug war in America. Without cannabis being criminal, it was very hard to have a drug war. The numbers are just too small. And that's why cannabis is Schedule I, and that's why they went for it, very aggressively for cannabis crimes. The mass incarceration that flowed from the drug war in America that we're now trying to unwind is in large part the result of cannabis being criminal. What happened in America is we passed all these 3 strikes laws that if you had 3 felonies, you would go to jail for a ridiculously long amount of time. And very often, at least one of those strikes was a cannabis crime. So cannabis there was a huge social justice problem here that had to be addressed. And one way to address it was by legalizing cannabis and emptying the jails of people who had cannabis convictions. Is there such a problem with psilocybin? Most people who want psilocybin are obtaining it, they're not being arrested. So I think the risk of going this political route right now, at a time when the drugs are working their way through the federal approval process, the FDA approval process, there have been no obstacles put in the way. The FDA is being very encouraging. The process hasn't been political. That we could risk that and that process by having a big political debate now about psilocybin. And that's kind of what the point I was trying to make. When in politics, you have to not only choose your fight, but you have to choose when to fight it. And I don't think this is the right moment. I think we're getting green lights on medical, approval as a medicine. That's true, that won't necessarily help everybody else, and we do have to address that. But I think it'll be easier to address once it is approved as a medicine. So my take was, let's not rush. Now there's another ballot initiative that's coming in Oregon, the state of Oregon, which is very progressive on drug policy and many policies. It's more Californian than California in some ways. that would legalize guided psychedelic therapy and provide for a whole regime of training of guides and licensing of guides by the state. That's interesting. I'm not sure what I think about it yet, to be honest. It may have the same kind of risk, but it's telling a different story about psychedelics than mere legalization, which is that these are, profound experiences, somewhat risky experiences. Maybe you want a guide involved, that it will need to be regulated in some way. And where we are, I think, or where we're getting as a society is trying to figure out what's the proper container to put these powerful medicines in. We have a medical container that's been evolved that seems to work pretty well. We have very promising research coming out of Imperial College and NYU and Johns Hopkins, and many other universities are about to start this work. So we know about that container. It's the guided trip where you're prepared very carefully, usually by two guides. They sit with you during the experience and they help you make sense of it after. And they're available if any adverse events happen. And then we have this religious container, which also seems to work pretty well. We have 2 ayahuasca churches in America that can legally use ayahuasca under, they have a constitutional right under separation of church and state. And you have the Native American Church, which has the right to use peyote in their ceremonies, again, assured by Congress and the Supreme Court. So that's it. So you have a religious container, a medical container, and then there is the rest of us. And we haven't yet figured out what that container is. And it's going to look a little bit like both of them, probably. But I think we need to figure that out before we legalize it.